Wario has had a number of his own games over the years, most notably Wario Land, a series of great side-scrolling platform puzzle games, most of them on Game Boy, but the latest one released for the Wii in 2008. Most recently, the Greedy Yellow Treasure Hunter is probably more recognized for his WarioWare series, a crazy and hectic collection of fun micro mini-games that works surprisingly well. But the game I'm going over today is one that I feel is often overlooked. Wario World, released in 2003 for the GameCube, is Wario's first and to this day only 3D platformer, and it seems like people hardly ever talk about it. Heck, even the Wario series wiki page makes no mention of it whatsoever, making you click on a subpage of other games, which it also doesn't appear to be in until you scroll up and find it squeezed between the other main releases. It's almost like they're trying to bury this game's existence, but does it deserve it? Let's get into it. The game opens with a brief story on an evil jewel that fed on the selfish desires of people and threatened to overrun the lands until some forest sprites managed to lock the jewel away in their ancient ruins. That was until a certain greedy treasure hunter came upon the jewel and added it to his hoard. Sure enough, the jewel, empowered by the greed flowing through Wario's castle, broke free, destroying his lavish home, scattering its treasures, and converting everything into crazy, surreal landscapes. This is the hub world we're spat into, which begins the game. The gates lead to 4 different worlds, each with their own theme. There's Excitement Central, Spooktastic World, Thrillsville, and Sparkle Land, with the 5th area being the Treasure Square, which can only be properly accessed once all the worlds have been completed. Each world has 2 levels, and then a big boss fight to finish things up. But each level also has a boss that must be defeated before you can move on. So how do the levels work? The bulk of the levels are structured on a 3D plane, but with a fixed camera perspective, sort of like Crash Bandicoot or maybe Little Nightmares. You have a few objectives here as you run from the start to the end of the level, bashing through hordes of enemies and solving the occasional puzzle to progress. Scattered throughout the levels are pieces of golden Wario statues which upgrade your health for each one completed. There's also these colorful buttons which trigger chests to appear on corresponding pedestals hidden throughout. This is more of a completionist thing, but it's cool to see what different treasures you can find, each level having their own theme. You can even unlock some WarioWare games for your Game Boy Advance if you find enough of these. Besides that, there's also little cages that contain wood spritlings who give you helpful tips and hints. The amount of these you save affects the ending you get once you beat the game. Sort of like the amount of money you get by the end of Luigi's Mansion. While it's good to keep an eye out for all of these, they're not necessary for completing the levels. What is mandatory, however, is finding and collecting these red diamonds. The diamonds are found in these trapdoors that you must ground pound to enter, taking you to a challenge area. The challenge is usually either puzzle-based or platform-based depending on the background, and get more elaborate as you get deeper into the game. You can also move the camera around here, which works perfectly to introduce the more complicated platforming structures in these areas. Once you reach the end of a level, you must have enough of these to unlock the exit and face off against the boss. Otherwise, you'll have to do some backtracking. Thankfully, the game provides a transportation ball which gives you a shortcut to and from the start of the level, making this a bit faster. Let's get into the gameplay. I have to admit, at first glance, this probably looks similar to one of those low-budget games from an unknown developer that has awkward controls, but that actually couldn't be farther from the truth. Wario may be a brute, but he controls as tight as a tourniquet. The jumping feels good, with Wario able to grab onto ledges or use a dashing leap to cross longer distances. I think the challenge levels are evidence enough of how well Wario controls, as many of these rooms would be simply impossible if the gameplay wasn't so tight. Aside from his platforming, Wario also has plenty of combat moves to keep the baddies down. His punches, ground pound, and charging tackle are all a given, but he also has some super attacks, known in the game as mad moves, which add a little more depth to the gameplay. The Mega Toss is simply a supercharged throw, which is sometimes used to hit buttons or weak points. The Pile Driver is a crushing slam which devastates surrounding enemies and is required to enter the metal trapdoors. Finally, Wario has the Wild Swing Ding, which has Wario spinning around an enemy so quickly that eventually you're able to steer the makeshift tornado around to damage more foes or activate certain switches. It's fun using all these moves in different ways to take out the many groups of enemies. My personal favorite part of the game has got to be the bosses, so I'm glad there's a good number of them. They each have really entertaining and sometimes disturbing personalities. It's fun figuring out the strategy to take down each of them. Usually it involves avoiding whatever punishment they're trying to dish out, and then figuring out how to stun them so you can deliver a mad move on them to deal some damage. These bosses range from an enormous lady dinosaur in lingerie, a demented Jack Frost clone who will possess Wario if you look into his eyes, and a zombified magician who uses some shady tactics in battle. He might actually be my favorite boss in the game just for how you fight him. He hides in one of these giant cups, doing an oversized version of that ball and cup trick, but when you select the cup you think he's under, it seems like you failed at first. Nope, he's actually being a filthy cheater and he's sticking to the top of the cup. This is such a clever idea, I love it. There's generally the same several types of enemies in each level, but with different skins to better match the specific theme of the different worlds. This may feel a little lazy, but there are plenty of unique enemies to be discovered as well, like this huge blubbery guy that bounces Wario back, or these will mice that can only be seen and attacked via mirror. Even the repeated generic enemies are often used in clever ways, with these flying magnets which can be used as platforms, and these barrel busters which shoot up to attack airborne enemies if you pile drive them. For all the praise I've been giving this game, it does have its downsides. While the gameplay is generally fun, battling enemies does start to feel a bit repetitive on the longer stretches, especially when you're forced to do these little time gauntlet fights. The game itself is also pretty short. Although there's plenty of side objectives to come back to, I was able to 100% the game on my last playthrough in less than 7 hours, which means a basic playthrough can be done in even shorter time. While that isn't too much of an issue for me, as I'm totally fine with shorter, engaging experiences, it may be for those who like games stuffed with content. My biggest disappointment in the game is probably the final boss fight. It's fine for what it is, but it could really use a little extra since it's the last boss of the game. I actually found out eventually that the later released Japanese version of the game gave the boss more forms of attack, basically giving me exactly what I felt was missing from the original. It's just too bad that we didn't get the updated version here in the US. The life system I'm a little mixed on. When you run out of health, instead of having to restart, you have the option to spend some money to pick up right back where you left off, even in the middle of boss fights. On one hand, this is pretty cool and fits for Wario since he's so money hungry, losing some of it works well as a punishment. Speaking of punishment, if you fall into a pit on any of the levels, you end up in the Unicorn's lair where you're forced to break crates to find an escape spring before they take too much of your cash away. I'm mostly fine with this continue system. What I don't like, however, is that it enables players to brute force bosses instead of taking the time to properly learn how they work. To be fair, you could just choose to restart the boss fights yourself when you run out of health, and it is nice to have the option to use the extra help if needed. I'm just being a little picky. Overall, I think it's a shame that Wario World is such an overlooked GameCube title. I hope this review can inspire some people to give it a chance. No, it's not perfect, but it's a darn fun game overall. It plays very well, it has some really cool bosses, and it feels satisfying to complete all the little side objectives and challenges. If you have the chance to do so, I really recommend trying this game out.